Hello friend, welcome back to my kitchen. My name is Becky. If you're new, Josh just went to the store for me and picked up a large cabbage. This week, we are gonna spend the week together cooking my family's dinners. A lot of times when I do themed dinners, it's themed. So the theme might be stovetop or casserole or 30 minutes or under. The only theme for this is one, these are two meals this week we're gonna be making that I haven't made in a long time, and they're two of our favorites. Tonight's dinner is going to be buttered chicken, curry with homemade naan with fresh milled wheat. One of my goals for 2025 is to get more confident making our own bread products, whether I use all-purpose flour or I fresh mill it. Today we're gonna make fresh milled naan. The second recipe we're gonna be making, I don't know if that's gonna be tomorrow or the next day, is going to be stuffed cabbage. We haven't had this in forever and it's delicious. I did go to the store yesterday to pick up some things, but they only had teeny tiny cabbages. Josh just got back from the gym and he stopped at the store and he picked up this huge cabbage. I'm actually gonna throw this cabbage, I'm gonna rinse it off, throw it in the freezer, and I'm gonna try a new way to make stuffed cabbage without having to boil the leaves first. I've seen that go around. You all have told me that works, so we're gonna try that. I do not have to worry about breakfast this week because I have some breakfast prep here. This, I think, is the last ham and cheese bagel sandwich that we made together. I might be able to find one or two more, but I think that might be the last one. I just pulled these out of the freezer. We have 3 egg and cheese breakfast sandwiches with homemade English muffins and homemade bagels. These are gonna go in the refrigerator to thaw because they do warm up better if they are thawed overnight. So between this and the yogurt that I bought yesterday, that is going to be our breakfast for the week, so we don't really have to think about that. We've already gone through all those breakfast casseroles that I made, the ones that we kept behind that I didn't gift. So breakfast, I don't really have to think about. So I am gonna be spending a little bit more time on our dinners this week because I have no dinner party to plan for. We are gonna be making some homemade crackers today after I prep tonight's dinner. And then we're gonna be starting seeds. So I don't have a ton of big outside projects. I don't have any big cleaning or organizational projects I wanna get to today, just regular things like laundry, keeping up with dishes. So I thought this week would be fun to spend time in the kitchen with you making some really delicious dinner. The beauty of doing this meal prep in advance is this is how easy it is gonna be to have some homemade breakfast sandwiches. It's just a matter of taking them out of the freezer, popping them in the refrigerator to thaw. This is the one that was already thawed. Josh is gonna have that for breakfast. I did pull out the meat that we need for another recipe. So 2 of the recipes, stuffed cabbage and buttered chicken curry, are 2 of our family favorites, but we're gonna experiment with a new recipe that is going to be, what is it called? Now I just lost it. I can picture it. And I have a chuck roast thawing in the refrigerator. French onion pulled beef, French onion beef chuck roast, which is gonna be good. Chuck roast is quickly becoming my family's favorite meat, and so I saw this recipe and it sounded incredible that we're gonna serve either over noodles or potatoes. I haven't decided yet. So I have my meat thawing for that. And I've got my yogurt out for the marinade for tonight's dinner. I will timestamp these recipes because we're gonna be making them one after the other, along with a written recipe down below. So let's go ahead and get this washed up and in the freezer. Should I just throw it in the freezer? I've never done this before. Normally when I make stuffed cabbage, I take this whole head of cabbage and I put it in some boiling water, and it's very kind of messy and dangerous. But I have seen this reel where you can take your really large cabbage, should probably dry it off. I don't know if I should cover it. Yeah, maybe I'll just put it back in that bag because I don't know what day we're gonna get to this. Because you need this cabbage to freeze all the way through, and then you need it to thaw all the way through. And when I went to the store yesterday, the cabbages were teeny tiny, and so I'm glad Josh was able to find a large cabbage. This was the first recipe I ever made after watching a Martha Stewart episode. I was inspired by making it. My mom never made anything like this growing up, and it is one of our favorites. I don't make her recipe anymore the way she makes it, but I still do love stuffed cabbage. So in the freezer this goes. Now it's time to go ahead and make, or prep, I should say, tonight's dinner. It's still pretty early in the day and we're not going to be having dinner for quite some time, which is a good thing because we want our chicken to marinate. And the only produce prep I need to do is chop a ton of ginger. So I'm actually going to do this first, so I only have to dirty up one cutting board and one knife, and then we'll process our chicken after. So today is Tuesday. I was going to make this dinner yesterday, and that's why when I went to the store, I bought fresh chicken and I didn't thaw chicken from my freezer. But when I got home from running errands and grocery shopping, you know how it goes. I did not feel like making dinner. So we ate the last of the breakfast casseroles and we had that for dinner. We got that eaten up, and then today we're gonna start basically the week of dinners on Tuesday. I didn't really do any cooking yesterday at all. And 3 meals is what I have planned this week. Generally, that is more than enough to get us through for our lunches and for the rest of the dinners that I don't cook on that night. I am trying a new recipe today for buttered chicken. I'm still looking for my favorite recipe, and I'm really excited about this one. This one has a lot of delicious spices in it, and it just sounds like the technique is going to make for a really delicious dinner. Probably should throw this in the food processor and really blend it up, but I'm just going to take a minute to really, really finely dice this ginger. We will be blending the curry in a bit after it's cooked, so it doesn't have to be perfectly smooth, but I don't want really big chunks. I think that's probably good. I'm not sure if we're going to use all this ginger, but I wanted to get it chopped. If I don't use it all, I'll just freeze it and then I'll have it chopped and ready to go next time I need it. I don't need to chop any other produce because we are going to use some of our homegrown garlic that I already have minced in the freezer and onions that I already have diced in the freezer. And the reason I wanted to do my ginger first is so that now I can do my chicken and I can then throw my cutting board and my knife in the dishwasher. I have chicken thighs here. You can use chicken thighs or chicken breast, but I think what I'm gonna do, I haven't decided yet because it's only 10:30 in the morning. I'm getting this started pretty early in the day. I might actually throw this once it's fully cooked in my slow cooker to stay warm, and chicken thighs are less likely to dry out. And I forgot I need to actually cut these into bite-sized pieces, and I am taking the time to cut off any extra fatty bits just because those are not our favorite to bite into. But if you enjoy that part of the chicken and you don't want to cut that off, go ahead and skip that step. Just cut them into bite-sized pieces. And this recipe, which is really interesting, calls for a double marinade, which I have never done before on chicken. And it's one of the reasons I actually chose this recipe, because I thought that that was really intriguing. I have a bag in my freezer where anytime I cut off bits of chicken or beef, I go ahead and I throw it in a beef bag and in a chicken bag, whatever the bag needs to be. And then when I make chicken broth, I can throw that out and I can use that in chicken broth making. So I'm not gonna waste that. Now what I should have done is cut my lemon in half, because for the first marinade, we are going to marinate it in lemon juice and just a couple of our spices. Now, if you didn't have time to do this, say you wanted to start this marinade before you go to work and you didn't have time to do both steps, this is my new lemon juicer and I love it. Then I'm sure you could just add all the marinade ingredients for both marinades, step 1 and step 2. And honestly, I'm sure it would taste delicious. But since I have a little extra time on this day, I'm gonna go ahead and do it the way the recipe says. But you know me, sometimes I make recipes my own. So that was salt, pepper, lemon juice, and paprika. This actually calls for a specific type of chili powder, but I don't have that chili powder, and it said you can substitute paprika, so that's what I'm doing. So this is the first step, the first marinade. This is gonna go in the refrigerator for 20 minutes. Then we'll pull it out and add the rest of the ingredients. It has now been probably more like 30 minutes since this has been marinating. So now we're gonna add the rest of our ingredients, which is garam masala, cumin. Actually, this is coriander. Cumin. And I do not have fenugreek leaves, so I'm going to substitute some homegrown parsley, Greek yogurt, and some olive oil. If I was in a hurry, I would just have added all of these ingredients at one time and not done this in a separate step. But because I have that time today, we're going to see how this turns out by doing the lemon marinade first and then the yogurt marinade. So it's now 11:30. I'm going to cover this back up and we will come back to this at dinner time. I almost forgot two of the most important ingredients, and that's some of our ginger and some garlic. We will add more ginger and more garlic when we actually make our sauce, but this definitely needs to be in with the chicken to marinate in with the chicken. Dinner is quickly approaching, which means I need to get going on the naan bread because this needs to rise for about an hour. So it is time to get going on that. First thing I'm going to do is weigh out two different types of whole grain. I have kamut here and a hard white wheat. I like to weigh out the grain when I'm working with fresh milled recipes if they give the weight, because you only really want to grind what you're going to use. And if I weigh it out in a whole berry form and then grind it, I know I have the right amount, versus if I just grind a random amount and then I use cups and measures, I might not grind enough or I might grind too much. So even if I don't use weight for the rest of the recipe, I've been finding it very useful to use the weight for the grains. Now this recipe called for kamut and hard white. This is the first time I'm using kamut. The recipe that I'm following, I can link down below for you. I have her cookbook. We're actually going to cook out of her cookbook twice this week, and she also has all of her recipes linked on her blog post, so I can link those for you as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my freshly milled flour, and I'm going to mix that with the water and some honey, and I'm going to let that sit for about 15 minutes. One thing that I'm learning when it comes to working with fresh milled grains is that you want to let them sit and hydrate before you go and put all the ingredients in. So a lot of times fresh milled recipes will say, mix the flour in with the water and let it sit for 15 minutes. And that's what this recipe said to do. So while that was doing that, I went ahead and measured out the Greek yogurt we need and the oil, because there are a couple extra ingredients along with salt in this recipe that most breads don't have. So to our soaked grain, I'm going to add the yogurt and oil. It's going to look like it's not going to want to mix in, but it does eventually mix in. Now I'm going to mix in my rapid rise yeast and some baking powder. I'm pretty sure it was baking powder. I can't remember if it was baking powder or baking soda. And then we're going to let this rise for about an hour. So this is an interesting recipe because it has both yeast and a leavening agent. So that's now going to sit there. It needed for about 15-20 minutes actually. I let it rest for about an hour. I'm going to preheat my griddle to really hot, and we are going to take out our dough from our mixer and actually get this into the shape we want to cook it in. I first make it into a ball, and then I divide this into 8 equal pieces. When it comes to naan and tortillas and things like that, you can really make them as big or as little as you want. The recipe recommended 8. That's what I did, and that seemed like a good size. And I am using water here. This dough is pretty sticky. I have found that a lot of fresh milled recipes are pretty sticky, And that's because you want to make sure there's enough moisture in the dough so when they bake, they don't dry out. And this recipe says to use water to help prevent it sticking to your hands and to help prevent it sticking to your working surface versus using flour. We don't really want to incorporate more flour into this recipe, which I thought was really interesting. This is the first time I'm using water in this type of application. When I do stretch and folds for loaves, a lot of times I'll use water so the dough doesn't stick to my hands. But this was the first time I'd ever done it with naan. So now that I have my individual balls of oh my goodness, my individual dough balls, I'm going to try to flatten these out to an even thickness and into a round shape. I don't do a perfect job getting these into a round shape, but nonetheless, they taste the same whether they are round or not. And I'm getting these pretty thin, and I'm using water to kind of, again, prevent stickage. This cast iron, actually this is not cast iron, this is a carbon steel griddle. It wasn't quite hot enough for these first couple ones, but as it sits and continues to warm up, by the time I cook the next couple, the griddle is pretty piping hot, and so you get those little bubbles that you want to see. They only take about 30 seconds or so per side. Once the griddle pan is heated up, this first batch probably took about a minute and a half each side because my griddle pan wasn't quite heated enough. And then I did want to check these just to make sure they were fully cooked. And then I'm going to put them on a plate. I'm going to brush them with some butter. And then I'm going to put a towel on them so they can steam just like I would if I was making tortillas. I'm just going to tell you now, we do a taste test. Josh comes and these turned out incredible. We absolutely love them. They were soft and they actually made really good peanut butter and jelly roll-ups. The ones that we didn't end up eating with dinner on this night, we used as just like bread because I didn't have any sandwich bread made up, and they were delicious. So now that I am working on the naan, it's closer to dinner time, so I'm going to start the sauce. And the nice thing about curry is you can kind of start it and let it simmer away, and it just gets better and better. So here I've got in my enamel cast iron some butter, and I have some chopped onions from last year's garden. This is a perfect application to save myself some time and use up last year's onions by not having to chop these onions here. And now I'm going to take our marinated chicken. I want to get this up to room temperature a little bit. So I am going to put this chicken on a cookie sheet or baking sheet, and I have my oven preheated to 425 degrees. And then I'm going to add a little bit of peppers to our onions. So this is made, Josh, with 100% fresh milled wheat. It's kamut, I think, and hard white wheat. I can't quite remember. They're pretty thin, but I think that's what's going to make it nice. Look how soft that is.
Kamut?
Kamut. It's a varietal of wheat. Now that looks pretty soft. Obviously we don't have it's still hot, our buttered chicken.
Oh, this with butter. Oh.
Yeah, that's what we're having for dinner tonight. Butter chicken.
Great texture.
Happy with that?
Nice and, I wouldn't say spongy.
Chewy.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I could clobber some of this for sure. Like a lot of it.
Wow.
How much do you have here?
I have 8 of them. You can take the rest of this one, but we probably should save it.
It's okay, we'll save it for dinner.
Okay.
Because I might need all 8. That's so good.
So good.
Perfect texture.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Josh decided to take the rest of that naan. Flatbreads are kind of Josh and I's favorite. Anything like a pita or naan or tortilla, we really, really, really like those things. And the fact that we were able to do 100% fresh milled, pretty exciting. My oven is still preheating. I'm getting my chicken up to room temperature a little bit so that it's not going into the oven refrigerator cold. I'm glad I added these peppers. These peppers from my garden are just so flavorful. And I'm not gonna add a green chili pepper to this because I don't want this to be spicy for my family because I'm the only one in my family that likes spicy things. So this is gonna add the pepper flavor, but no heat. I did want to mention also for my rice, I'm just cooking a long grain rice. If I was just having this, I probably would do a basmati rice, but I'm gonna take the leftover rice that we don't eat with the curry today and for lunch probably tomorrow or the next day. I'm gonna turn that into the rice that we're gonna need for our stuffed cabbage. So I just used a long grain, kind of more mild flavored rice. While this is cooking, I'm gonna get out all the spices I need to go into this. I want this to cook down and caramelize, so this is probably gonna take a good 8 or so minutes, maybe 10 or 15. That's gonna give me enough time to get all my spices out. I turned this down a little bit because I was paying attention to the spices, and I'm gonna make a little well in the center, and I'm gonna add some more butter because we're gonna bloom our spices in that butter. Most spice flavor compounds are fat soluble, so that's why we are gonna toast these spices in this fat. I have paprika, cumin, coriander, clove, cardamom, nutmeg, cinnamon, pepper, salt, and I think that's everything that's in here. The recipe originally says to use fresh whole cardamom, not fresh, but whole cardamom, whole clove, and whole cinnamon stick. Well, I have a cinnamon stick, but I don't have whole cardamom, and I don't have whole clove, but I have ground. So we're gonna use that instead. Now I just put in all of my ginger and my garlic. I'm gonna saute that actually for a minute first before we add our spices. Oh my goodness, that already with that garlic and ginger smells incredible. And the onions and peppers. This is gonna come together relatively quickly now that I have all of my ingredients out. I'm gonna add my spices. I did not measure those fully, I just kind of guesstimated that. Saute that for a couple minutes, well, probably about a minute. I don't want to burn my spices, but I do want to toast them. Another thing this recipe says is to use fresh tomatoes. It is February, and I have a hard time buying fresh tomatoes when I have homegrown, home-jarred, fresh tomatoes right here. So that is what I'm going to use instead. Do you hear that beautiful pop on there? This is just tomatoes crushed up. I'm going to put that in here. We are going to blend this sauce so that everything is smooth, but I'm going to let the tomatoes and the spices and the peppers all get to know each other in here before we do that. And I think I'm going to use a hand blender. I don't think I'm going to pull out my whole blender. And this is acidic because the tomatoes are acidic. I don't really want that splashing onto my griddle. So I'm just going to pull my griddle over here just so that my acidic tomatoes don't splash on that. I want these flavors to come together and really intensify, but I don't really want it to reduce too much. So I'm going to put the lid on this and let this just simmer. I don't know if you're ever guilty while making dinner to walk away and get distracted and forget what you're doing. Well, I just did that, and we almost had a disaster on our hands, but we did. The tomato sauce mixture almost burnt, but I saved it. It scorched a little bit. I was able to pour off the top part that is nice and not scorched, and I'm going to put this in my pot here because I'm going to actually blend this with a stick blender in just a second. I figured it'll be easier to do that in this pot, and our chicken is almost done, and then everything will fit in one pot. So nothing's burnt or ruined or anything like that. This has come together and thickened up nicely. We are going to thin this out with some cream, but before I add the cream, so our chicken is beautifully brown. That's what I wanted, to get some nice, beautiful color, because obviously I'm not cooking that in a tandoori oven. I probably should have put a piece of parchment paper down, but these pans do clean up relatively nicely, and they have some beautiful color on the chicken now. I'm gonna get this in my pot, and then I'm gonna get this cookie sheet or baking sheet in some water to soak off some of that cooked on bits. The cool thing about this recipe that I'm following today gives you directions on how to make homemade cashew milk or cream if you want to do that. But I'm just going to use good old heavy cream. If you left the chicken out and you used the cashew cream, you could make this into a vegan dinner. Okay, so now everything's together. The chicken is fully cooked. I did check its internal temperature. I'm gonna give this a taste test real quick, and then I'm gonna put it on as low as my stove will go, because we're not quite ready to eat dinner yet, and it doesn't hurt for this just to simmer and get to know each other. Depending on how acidic my tomatoes are, sometimes when I make butter chicken, I do add maybe a tablespoon of brown sugar, but sometimes you don't have to do that because the cream adds some sweetness to it. And this makes a beautiful make-ahead freezer meal too. You can make it just the sauce and freeze the sauce and don't add chicken. You can add the chicken and freeze it, and it thaws beautifully. We're almost there. It does need a good amount of salt because it's kind of, I can taste it, but I can tell that it doesn't have enough salt yet. I went ahead and I just added the rest of that cream because I didn't really feel like putting it back in the fridge. And we're gonna give this a taste test one more time. Okay, that is perfect. It does feel like it needs to simmer and kind of come together, but I don't think it needs any level of sweetness. I don't think it needs any more salt. So I'm just gonna put this lid on kind of halfway, let some of it steam off, and just kind of let all those flavors marinate. Our naan is done, our rice is done. We're just gonna let this simmer till we sit down and eat dinner. This was so warm and comforting and delicious. It was actually better when I was having it for lunch the following couple days. Just something about it sitting there and the flavors marinating and just so yummy. So it is now the next morning, and it's pretty early in the morning, and I'm going to get going on dinner. Now, this is something I have never made before. I saw a recipe, and it was very intriguing. It was French onion braised chuck roast, or like slow cooked, pull apart tender chuck roast, and I thought that sounded incredible. And I went ahead and read about 5 or 6 recipes to find one that I wanted to make, and I couldn't find one that was exactly what I wanted. So on this day, I make this recipe up, and it is probably one of our new favorite dinners. We devoured this. It was so good. So I'm going to show you how we make it. The first thing I'm going to do is take this chuck roast. This was one that I had bought from a local farmer, and it was in my freezer. I pulled it out of my freezer a couple days ago and let it thaw in my refrigerator. And now it is ready to go ahead and trim any excess fat on it. We don't need any big pieces of fat. There's still plenty of fat running through this piece of meat that the outside pieces that I could cut off, I went ahead and trimmed off. I now am going to brown this chuck roast really well because we are going to cook this chuck roast in the slow cooker. You could cook this in the oven, low and slow, in a Dutch oven if you wanted, but I was busy on this day and I didn't really want to have to worry about babysitting my dinner. So I went ahead and put it in the slow cooker. Now to the cast iron that we browned our chuck roast in, I put a lot of onions. This was the onions that I grew in my garden last year, and so they were really little, so I probably put like 10 or 12 onions in here with a good 3 tablespoons of butter. But if you were using large store-bought onions, probably 3 or 4 or 5 would be really good. Now, I make up this recipe because I couldn't find one I wanted. So I will write this up, and I took measurements on everything so I can write it up and link it down below for you. So once my onions were beautifully caramelized, because we're making a French onion slow-cooked beef roast, I went ahead and added 2 tablespoons of brown sugar and 1/3 cup of flour. So a lot of the recipes I was looking at called for gravy packets. I don't keep gravy packets in my house, and I don't keep cans of French onion soup in my house either, but I have all the ingredients to make this. So that's why I figured I could go ahead and make it myself. So here to the caramelized onions, I added some thyme, pepper, a lot of whole garlic cloves, and 1/3 cup of flour. I cooked that flour down for a couple minutes with the butter, and then I'm going to add my chicken broth. Now you could use beef broth if you wanted here. I'm using chicken broth because that's the only kind of broth I have made up in my house right now. I get that question, why don't I use beef broth ever? And it's because I don't have beef broth in my house at this point. So chicken broth works as a good substitute. So to that sauce, I'm going to let it simmer. I added about a tablespoon of grainy mustard and 2 tablespoons of Worcestershire sauce. I figured by adding the flour to this and kind of creating a thicker sauce, that's going to replace the gravy packet. I have never done that much flour in a slow cooker recipe before, and it works perfect. So at this point, I'm thinking maybe this is a little bit thick, but you will see this creates the best gravy. Absolutely delicious. So I'm going to pour that sauce with my chuck roast in the slow cooker. I had my slow cooker on high while I was making the sauce. The onions took a long time to caramelize. They took about 25 minutes. So that's why the slow cooker is bubbling away, because the sides of that slow cooker were hot, because I figured the chuck roast could just start to cook while I cooked down the onions. I'm going to put this on high for about 8 hours and just let this go. Now, I could not decide what I wanted to serve with this beef. So I decided, after lots of thought, I'm going to make hoagie rolls, and we're going to turn this beef into French onion sandwiches. And it is incredible. My other 2 thoughts that would be really, really good with this meal would be to serve this over mashed potatoes, because it does make this really, really beautiful gravy, or over egg noodles. And I actually end up taking some of the leftovers, because we end up using some of these hoagie rolls for sandwich bread, because again, I don't have any sandwich bread made up. So after we went through all the naans and I had some of this, we were using this as sandwich bread. I still had some of the beef that needed to be used up. So I ended up putting the rest of it over some egg noodles, and it was fantastic. So here we're going to make some hoagie rolls. I will link this cookbook that I'm getting this recipe out of down below, but she also has a blog post. This is the same author as who created the naan recipe, and so I can link both the blog post recipe and the cookbook down below. But what we need to do again with this recipe is we need to grind our wheat. This recipe called for, I think, 100% hard white wheat berries. And we're going to mix in all the ingredients minus the yeast and let this sit, well, it was only supposed to sit for like 15-20 minutes, but I hadn't showered yet, so I go shower and then come back, so it ends up sitting longer than that. I was not ready for the day when this is where the dough rested with the water before adding the yeast. I actually let it rest for about an hour and a half because I was getting ready. That's the beauty of fresh milled wheat, is if you mix the wheat in with the water, but you don't add the yeast, you're not under a time crunch. Once you add the yeast, you're kind of under a time crunch. But I got ready, and then I added the yeast, and then I let that sit for about an hour. Here you can see this is what the chuck roast is looking like after just a few hours cooking away. It still has quite a bit of time it needs to cook away. At this point in the day, I am ready for the day, and my roll dough is ready to go. So this is where you can see this dough is pretty sticky. That's the one thing, is I have to resist the urge to add more flour, and I'm learning that the more I work with not just fresh milled wheat, but also all-purpose flour dough recipes. Even with all-purpose flour dough recipes, it is best to err on the side of less flour is better than more flour, because you're going to end up with a lighter, more moist bread product. So I'm going to turn this dough out. It rose perfectly for the first time. I'm going to shape this into hoagie rolls. Now, the recipe says to make 4 hoagie rolls with this. These end up being huge. So you could absolutely, if you wanted more like an individual size hoagie roll, make 8 out of here. But what I did was 1 hoagie served Josh and I. We cut the sandwich in half and we each had half, and this made a good size sandwich for us. But if you wanted individual hoagie rolls, then you could divide this into 8. To shape the hoagie rolls, I just kind of flatten the dough out a little bit, roll it up, and tuck the ends in. These are not perfectly shaped. I did go through a couple of them and redo it a few times because I was, having a hard time shaping these, but they end up turning out perfect. No one's going to know that I had a hard time shaping these. But I do flatten them out quite a bit. So just like if I was to make hamburger buns homemade, once you shape it to what you want, it is best to flatten out those rolls so that because they will puff up, but they won't go outwards. And so you want to make sure you have enough surface area, flat surface area, to put your sandwich on. So these don't look very big yet at this point. And I'm thinking, man, these are kind of skinny. And I don't know if we're going to be able to make good size sandwiches out of these, but you just wait. There is plenty of yeast in here that the yeast is going to activate. It's going to do its thing, and it's going to make a beautiful hoagie. But before I let it rise for the second time, I do take a little bit of oil and I top the hoagies with that just so they don't dry out. I cover them with some plastic wrap, and then I'm going to let this sit for about an hour. I'm checking on my beef. It's not quite as tender as I want. I really want it to be fall apart tender. So I just check on it. I turn the beef, rotate it so that the bottom is on the top and the top is on the bottom. And I put the lid back on and I let this cook. You can see already, look how thick and beautiful this sauce is. Absolutely incredible. The onions were starting to stick just a little bit to the slow cooker, so I was running my fork along the edge of the slow cooker to make sure that we didn't get any scorching. And I put my hoagie rolls next to the slow cooker so that they would rise next to the heat of the slow cooker. And after about an hour, they were well puffed, and I'm going to get those in the oven. They did not take very long to cook. You could probably put an egg wash on them if you wanted, or brush them with butter after they come out of the oven. I didn't do either of those things, and they still looked beautiful. At this point, it's been quite a few hours now, and this has been sitting and cooking away. Here you can really see how thick and beautiful this sauce is. The one thing with this sauce, because it was pretty thick and rich, is that I did have to go through about once an hour or so and just make sure that the onions weren't sticking to the side of the pot. Our beef is beautifully tender at this point, so I'm going to pull the beef out of the slow cooker, and I am going to remove any big pieces of fat that are still on the chuck roast and the bone and things like that, so that I just have nice tender meat going to go back into the slow cooker. And because I did a pretty good job trimming the chuck roast before it went in, there isn't a ton of fat that needs to be separated, which was really nice. So like that piece right there that I just took off, that's not something Josh and I want to eat. So I always take the time to remove any of those bits. Now I'm going to shred the beef. This is Josh with his fork. He wanted to give it a taste test because my house smelled incredible. And he's taking a sneak taste test, and it is so good. This is probably one of the best chuck roasts I have made, and I've made quite a few of them recently because, like I said, this is one of my family's favorite cuts of meat at this point right now, and so I am trying to make a ton of it, and this is at least my favorite, I think, and I think Josh would probably argue this is probably one of his favorites as well. So I'm putting my shredded beef back into the sauce. Here you can see why this would be so good with egg noodles or over mashed potatoes. But I chose to turn this into a sandwich. So this is what the hoagie looks like coming out of the oven. Nice and soft. I'm going to cut this in half, and then I'm going to cut it because I'm going to make two sandwiches, one for me, one for Josh. And fresh milled wheat is not like store-bought whole wheat flour. It comes out so much more fluffy and soft and flavorful. I have found when I use store-bought whole wheat flour, it's kind of dry and doesn't have a ton of beautiful nutty flavor. But with this fresh milled wheat, it has so much nutty flavor and it's not dry. Every time I make a new roll or something like that, I'm always surprised how moist, I know people don't like that word. What's another word? Not dry. How not dry the roll is. They're just so yummy and they feel super nourishing and delicious. But this sandwich is not done. We are going to top it with Gruyere cheese. This is what makes it French onion, between the onions and the Gruyere cheese. And I'm going to put this under the broiler and I'm going to toast this for about 4 or 5 minutes under the broiler. This is what makes it French onion. So if you wanted to make this beef and serve it over mashed potatoes, you could put the Gruyere cheese over top of the beef, over top of the mashed potatoes, or you could put the Gruyere cheese in the mashed potatoes and then put the beef on top if you wanted. That would be delicious. Or like what I did when we used the leftover beef, I just cooked up some egg noodles, warmed up the beef in the gravy, and then mixed in some Gruyere cheese. So you got that Gruyere cheese flavor with the egg noodles, and that was delicious. My favorite way was with the egg noodles. This was Josh's favorite way with the sandwiches. He had this for lunch, I think 3 times. He really, really enjoyed it. And so did I. And there you can see what they look like coming out of the oven. Hello friend, welcome back. We are going to be making stuffed cabbage today, which I'm greatly looking forward to because I haven't made stuffed cabbage in I think 2 years. So this is the cabbage that we popped in the freezer a couple days ago. And this morning I took it out of the freezer. I had it sitting on my counter to thaw. I realized that's going to take a very, very long time to thaw. So I actually popped it in my oven with the oven light on so that it would thaw a little bit quicker, just because when you have your oven light on, it does create some warmth and it hopefully helps speed up the thawing process. That's the one thing I guess with this technique is you need to give yourself time for the cabbage to freeze, and then you have to give yourself time for the cabbage to thaw. It is only 11:49 right now, but I'm gonna get going on dinner first thing because today is the day I am starting my seeds for the first time. And we're gonna spend some time outside doing this. I'm gonna probably get a little bit dirty. So I figured let's get dinner done and ready to go. So all I have to do is pop it in the oven come dinner time. So the first thing I wanna do before there we go. Before I get going on taking that cabbage apart, is I'm gonna get going on the red sauce so this can simmer and cook down and be ready for us when we are ready for it. I'm actually making a different recipe this time. I thought, because it's been a long time since I've made it, let's try a new one this time. So I will link this recipe down below. To start our red sauce, I'm gonna put a little bit of butter in our pot with some onions. While that's cooking away, let's make our filling. I've got ground beef here, some caramelized onions. The recipe calls for diced onions, but when I was doing a little bit of shopping for this recipe in my pantry and freezers, I found these caramelized onions in there, and I thought that would be really good to add a little bit of sweetness to balance out some of the acidity we're gonna get from the tomato sauce. The filling's gonna come together really quickly because we already have our pre-cooked rice here. I have seen recipes that say you can use raw rice, and I have tried that in the past and never had good luck with it. So I always like to use pre-cooked rice when it comes to this recipe, just so that I know we're not gonna end up with crunchy rice. Add some salt, pepper, parsley. You could use fresh. I don't have any right now, so I'm just going to use some freeze-dried. A good amount of that. Our caramelized onions. And to that, I'm going to add some garlic powder. You could use fresh, but I'm just going to use some garlic powder. Now I'm gonna take a second to get in there with my hands and get this all mixed up. That is all mixed up and smells delicious. If you've never made caramelized onions and froze them, I highly recommend it because it adds such delicious flavor to things, but you don't have to go through the effort of caramelizing them every time you want them. Also, try using frozen onions for things. It's a huge time saver. You can buy them in the frozen section of your grocery store, or if you find onions on sale, or you grow them in your garden, or you find them from a local farmer, dice them up and freeze them. That'll also save you a ton of time. And at first, I didn't know if I was gonna like this frozen cabbage hack, but there's something really nice. One reason why I don't make this very often is I don't like dealing with a big pot of water on the stove boiling to peel the cabbage. And I don't have to worry about that, but you do have to think about making sure you give yourself enough time for that cabbage to thaw. So here I have some pre-minced up garlic from my garlic I grew in my garden last year. I'm gonna get that sauteed up. I'm gonna season this with a little bit of salt, some pepper. Oop, a lot of pepper, that's okay, I like pepper. Toast the spices a little bit. let that garlic thaw and cook down just a bit. Now I have some crushed tomatoes here. Let me get this in here, and this does need to cook down a little bit. It's a little on the runny side. And I'm actually gonna put 2 of these in here because I like the sauce. Maybe 2 2/3. We'll start with that and see what that looks like. Now we're gonna let this reduce and turn into a yummy sauce. We have a few more ingredients we need to add, but I'm gonna let this cook for just a bit before I add those. And we're gonna turn our attention back to this cabbage, which I did cut the core out of it already, and it still is a little bit frozen on the inside. So hopefully I'll be able to peel all these leaves off. This is working so well. I originally did not think I was gonna like this technique because of having to remember to thaw it. But now that I'm peeling it, yeah, because this is kind of frozen, which is not ideal. But not having to boil it is so nice. This is probably enough for the filling of cabbage rolls we have. I can let this continue to thaw here. So let's go ahead and start stuffing these while our sauce reduces. I might actually make this more since this was so easy. I can't remember if this was something I watched or something you all mentioned to me that I should try, but this is one of those hacks that I didn't actually think was going to work that well, and this is definitely a hack that works so well. I don't like dealing with the big pot of boiling water because normally what I do when I make these is I cut the core out of the cabbage. I have a big pot of boiling water. I have to stick the cabbage with the core side up so the head, the top of the head is down in the boiling water. It usually has to sit in there for 45 seconds to a minute, and then you can take it out of the water, peel a leaf off, and then put it back in the water, then take it out. And the putting the cabbage in and out of the water tends to make a mess of really hot boiling water on the stove and yourself, and it's just kind of a lot of work, and it's why I never make stuffed cabbage, hardly ever, even though we love it. And this hack was a winner. If I make stuffed cabbage again, this is the only way I'm going to make it from now on. But again, you do have to remember it takes a good 2 hours for, at least 2 hours for me, for my cabbage to thaw enough to where I could work with it. And you could probably even thaw it in the refrigerator too overnight. So like day 1, you get home from the grocery store, throw your cabbage in the freezer, and then the night before you want to actually make this, just remember to take the cabbage out of the freezer and throw it in your refrigerator and let it thaw. And then you can roll up and stuff your cabbage rolls, easy peasy. I added about a tablespoon of butter to add a little bit more richness to it. I'm now going to add 2 tablespoons of sugar and 1 tablespoon of red wine vinegar. So this recipe is a little bit different than the one I normally make. I normally make Ina Garten's recipe, which has raisins in it and way more vinegar than that. And I thought that this one, I guess I'm not following it exactly, but this one is a little different. It has a little less vinegar, a little less sweetness, and we'll see how this red sauce comes out. I'm gonna taste this in just a second and adjust seasonings as needed. I think I'm actually gonna turn the heat off because that looks like a good consistency, and I just got the black pepper flavor, and that is so yummy. So you can bake this in a couple different vessels. I have always made this recipe in my Dutch oven, so that's what I'm gonna do. But you could line these in a 9x13 baking dish if you wanted. But for some reason, every time I make it in this pot, and I enjoy that, and it's kind of tradition, so that's what I'm gonna do. And I'm gonna go ahead and cook all this cabbage with this. So what I'm gonna do is bring our sauce over here, and I'm gonna take a little bit of our sauce and put this on the bottom of our pot so we don't get any sticking. And this sauce will continue to reduce in the oven when I actually cook these. cabbage rolls. And the cool thing about this is homegrown onions, garlic, and tomatoes. Now I'm going to take the rest of my cabbage that's been frozen, and I like to line the bottom of my pot with the extra cabbage. This is a little frozen. I love the way that the cabbage at the bottom, and you're gonna see at the top, kind of stews in the sauce and cooks down. And that's why I always go ahead and put a layer of the extra cabbage that I didn't stuff at the bottom of the pot. And then I layer that with some of our cabbage rolls, and then I'm gonna top that with our sauce, and then layer with more cabbage rolls and top with the extra cabbage. I really like the flavor of how just the cabbage leaves themselves kind of stew in the sauce. So usually when I have a cabbage roll, I'll have one cabbage roll and a few of the extra leaves. There's not really much else I could think of doing with the cabbage leaves other than cooking them with the cabbage rolls, especially doing this frozen method, because they're already frozen and they wouldn't really make a good coleslaw or something like that after being frozen. And that's what I've always done, even when I do the boiling method, is I just take the extra leaves and I just stew it in with the sauce. And I really enjoy that. It's actually one of my favorite parts of stuffed cabbage, is just the cabbage leaves stewed in the red sauce. And this was a really good recipe. I will definitely make this recipe again. I thought it had a good balance of sweetness and tartness along with the beef. I'm gonna let this cool down just a little bit on the stove here. And then I'll put the lid on that, and then I'll pop that in the fridge. And come dinner time, I will preheat my oven and I will let that cook. And at that point, this will be cold. So I'm guessing it's gonna take a good hour and a half to cook. And that is dinner tonight. I just got all of my onions and snapdragons started for this year's garden. And probably about a half an hour or so ago, I went ahead and I put this in the oven. It was so nice that I was able to prep this meal in advance because I could just pop it in the oven, and this was delicious. I really liked the tartness and sweetness level of the red sauce with the beef. Like I said, I would absolutely make this particular recipe again. And this is what dinner looks like pulled together. I always top it with a little bit of sour cream or Greek yogurt, depending on what I have. And I want to thank you, friend, for being here as we cooked up 3 delicious dinners. They were all a little bit different, actually very different, and all incredibly delicious. Our new favorite recipe by far, though, is that French onion beef. So yummy and so satisfying. So thank you for being here. Let me pop some more videos here you can enjoy between now and my next upload. I had a lot of fun making new recipes using 100% fresh milled wheat. That is a goal of mine for 2025, and we are on our way to learning how to make some delicious recipes using that. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being you, and I can't wait to see you next time. Bye, friend.